Welcome to another episode of Conversations and Connections. I'm speaking from Melbourne right now, so at the outset, I wish to acknowledge that I'm on unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Our guest today is Dr. Ruth Gamble, an environmental and climate historian who works on Tibet and the Himalayas. Ruth teaches at the Department of Archaeology and History at Trobe University in Melbourne and has 2 books and is working on her 3rd. The first book, Reincarnation in Buddhism, was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Her second book, A Biography of the Third Karmapa, was published in 2020, and her third, one that is she's currently working on, and one I'm personally very excited about, is the history of the Yarlung Sangpo, or as we call it in Eastern Assam, the Buraluit or Brahmaputra. Welcome to the podcast, Ruth. So glad you could make it.
It's really nice to be here.
So right off, I'm going to start asking you questions. And the first one would be such an obvious one, but you have so much to tell us. How did you get interested in studying the Himalayas?
Yes, that's a really strange. Yeah, it's got to be a bit of a journey. There has to be a story there to go from kind of, lower middle class suburban Brisbane to the Himalaya. I always wanted to go, and I was one of those kids that had pictures of National Geographic on the wall, which I know is terribly imperial. But at the time I didn't. I just had pictures everywhere, and I always wanted to go anywhere. But I actually also used to take my skateboard and go to meditation classes with a Tibetan monk who told me all about the mountains. So I kind of, from when I was about 15, I think, I started going to those classes. And then when I was in university, I managed to get a small, not very much money at all, and got on a plane and went over to India and traveled around by myself for a little bit as an 18-year-old, which was a bit interesting. And I still remember to this day the first time I saw the Himalaya. I got a bus from Gorakhpur to Kathmandu, and we stopped in to get chai on the way up. And this guy standing next to me was like, "Oh, you can see the mountains." And I lifted my head to see the mountains, but as an Australian, my idea of where mountains are didn't match, right? So I couldn't see mountains. I could just see the side of a hill. And he put his head under my chin and lifted it right up, so I was looking straight up at the sky. And he's like, "The mountains." And I was like, "Oh my God." And I was so blown away and it's still kind of with me, that sense of what the hell is that? Those mountains up in the sky just blew me away. And I was really, fascinated by snow. So there's this combination of, I'd gotten a lot from learning from these Tibetan monks. And then also I was absolutely fascinated by the place, right? So it was, and I'd had this thing growing up that I wanted to be a marine biologist, but I was rubbish at maths. So looking at the Himalaya as an environmental space was a way that I got to, it's something that makes me really want to get out of bed every morning. Right, I'm fascinated by the place and the culture, but then the environmental aspect to it is just so fascinating that if I can, I'm really excited to be learning things almost every day.
And how did you then? Sorry.
That's all right.
But I really had to ask you this. So how your second book, your first book was again on reincarnation and the afterlife. Your second book again was a biography, right? So how did your journey lead to all of that?
Right. So I started going to the mountains, and I ended up working I worked as a journalist, and I was rubbish at it. And then I won a scholarship to go and study Tibetan language and be an interpreter for some of the senior monks between Tibetan and English. So I went and lived in the mountains and studied Tibetan, Hindi, and philosophy. But I kind of was, when I'd done that for a little bit, I was still really interested in other things. And I went to do a PhD, did another degree in Asian studies as opposed to journalism, went to ANU, and I was thinking of doing a PhD. And I was actually I was really fascinated by the language and literature and culture. And I was going to do research on another person called Milarepa, who's a famous scholar saint. And someone had done that. So I had a few gin and tonics and started working through the works of other people I might be interested in that was kind of in the same tradition as Milarepa. and found this collection of works by this man called the Third Karmapa. And there was stuff in there that was really, he was a guru to the last Mongol emperor of China and Central Asia. And there was stuff in his life stories and his poems that was kind of managed to meld those two interests that I had of environmental descriptions and landscape and sacred landscape, as well as the poetry and culture and religious traditions of the mountains. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write about him. But because I was working with Tibetan texts, in order to write about him and his life, and he was the first to be recognized as a reincarnate, like the Dalai Lamas are recognized as a reincarnate. He was the first to be recognized as a reincarnate as a child. So it was kind of where that whole tradition of getting kids and recognizing them as a reincarnation of someone else comes from. It's his life story. So, so I started looking into his work, and through that, to do that, I had to translate his biography and 140 of his poems. So that meant that I had a lot of source materials, and that was enough for 2 books, basically. So the first one, Reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism, looks at how that tradition developed and actually is related to the environment, because my argument is basically that the reincarnation traditions developed in association with sacred sites. So you had someone coming back to look after a sacred site. So the two things were linked. And then, so then I had enough left over from my PhD project to turn the rest of it into a biography.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was yeah.
This is, the whole journey is so amazing. If I can now bring you from, let's say, the past onto something more contemporary. You're a historian, so how does the discipline of international relations frame the Himalayas for historians like you or social anthropologists like me who want to study this region? And you've been doing so much work on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess you're getting this completely different background. Like most people who are interested in international relations don't start off their academic careers translating 140 poems by a 13th century saint. It's a bit of a weird angle to come at it from, but it meant that I was coming at it from within how, if you go into the mountains and I'd say I worked on these poems, or I translated these things, that people related to it. A lot of particularly in the Buddhist regions, related to it straight away. They're like, "Oh, he's a great saint or a great man or whatever," and so it was kind of coming from that perspective and looking out. And I've always been interested in politics and geopolitics. So when I started reading the descriptions of geopolitics and so on, I mean, that's kind of the journalism thing coming back in, right? The news junkie wanting to know what was happening in the mountains. I was reading it going, where is this place? Where are they talking about? I don't know this place. I don't see in the mountains. I don't see the only way that you see mainstream Indian culture manifest and mainstream Chinese culture manifest is through the presence of the army. It's not through the cultures of that place. So I did not recognize the description of this place that was in IR literature. So that kind of inspired me to figure out how people had come up with those ideas, and to try and kind of line up my experiences and what I'd seen and the experiences of my friends with how their home was being described in IR literature. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, So, I was going to ask you, and it makes perfect sense now to segue into this part of the conversation. How do present-day problems impact everyday life on the ground in the Himalayan region? The friends that you talk about.
Yeah. So the IR kind of vision of these worlds, these outlines on a map, and this kind of almost cartoonish version of the place is very different to what you see happening on the ground. But what I do think that the people living in the regions I worked in, they were always trying to negotiate borders And so for example, I have friends that live in Sikkim, and I remember sitting on their veranda, and I was allowed to go to Tibet. They weren't. I could see Tibet from their veranda, but I had to fly via Bangkok and Hong Kong, and then get a train in order to get back to just across the border. This real kind of geographical space. So that means that there's a lack of interconnection in places that used to be very connected. And it means that things are fixed when there used to be a lot of movement. So you had when people were living as traders, and they always went on pilgrimage, and there was also nomads. People were kind of moving all around the area, and that kind of fit with the ecological systems of the region. If you stay in one place, it kind of does do damage. It does damage in the mountains, and also the mountains are constantly moving, which is another thing I got annoyed with IR about. It's kind of the mountains, like there's earthquakes, there's landslides, the water changes. It's a very fluid place. So the people in the region had developed ways of dealing with that by moving or living lighter on the land, or relying on networks that are across the region. So the idea that they had to be fixed in place was really doing them and the environments around them kind of damage. And then you had threat multipliers on top of this, right? So you've got this kind of geopolitical issues, and then on top of that you have climate change, and then another thing that is the biodiversity of the region is incredibly intense, and so then that means when that starts breaking down, it has a dramatic effect on the people in the region too. So yeah, it's I guess the image was always moving. When I was on the ground, everything was always moving. Things were always happening. And when people try and make everyone stay still so that they can kind of control them, then that's when you end up with ecological damage. Yeah. And human damage. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about when you spoke of sitting on the veranda and looking at Tibet, I was just thinking of how, and this has a huge, as you would well know, this has a huge implication on how you deal with everyday stuff like floods and landslides and things like that, right? And you know, I live in Guwahati for most of the time, and we are just downstream from Bhutan. And you know, it'd be so much easier if we had until I think 2014 or 2012, we didn't have that kind of communication between districts in Bhutan and districts in Assam. So when the floodwater was released in a dam nearby in Bhutan, the communication would have to go via the embassy to the High Commission to Delhi, and then the Water Commission. So by the time it gets back to our district, the flood has already come, and people then begin to blame Bhutan for sending down floods, and
floods, no, it's absolutely the case. And I think that lack of communication, that was kind of as well coming from working with these communities and working as an interpreter for them and everything. That's kind of why I was drawn to looking at this cross-border issues, is because people can't move. It's hard for them to go to look at both sides of the border, and that was something that, as like an outsider, I had more chance of doing. Is being able to cross those boundaries and look at things from both perspectives, and get my head around like how the Chinese state sees it, how the Indian state sees it, how the Bhutanese state sees it, as opposed to being from one community you move into the other. You get a more in-depth understanding. But not often the opportunity to move across boundaries. So I clinically thought, how can I make a contribution without being there's something that's hopefully going to help as opposed to take away from. I really thought about that in terms of trying to focus what I was doing for research. And I keep seeing that all the time. Like Bhutan seems better though, right? That's like there's a lot of, it seems like mobile phones have helped to get communication.
Right.
Across that region. Localized.
So now they have something called the flood early warning systems so that the district commissioners in the bordering districts between Bhutan and Assam keep each other informed about what's happening. But that happened rather late. So you can imagine in 2012, it was a little bit, tense because the huge flood. And they thought, and this constantly happens even when the Kosi floods in Bihar. There's always, some kind of uproar against upstream communities, thinking that they're the ones who are responsible, when it's much more complicated than that. Yeah. But you brought up something about both China and the nation states, right? The big nation states around the Himalayas. And this is really a huge issue, a very critical issue in Assam right now, the one about dams, the race to build dams, in the eastern part of the Himalayas. So your work touches upon that. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening?
Yes. So I was actually thinking when you were saying about the communication, I see issues like that. That was part of the reason in this work on 13th on the Karmapas, the third Karmapa. His biography has stories about rivers shifting and having to get across them and having landslides come through. And, there's all of these kind of stories from the region that go all the way back, right, about having to live with this movement. And it seems to me like so it's a really long history, I think. And then the dams, what I noted was that there was like a competition to see who can be in charge of as much water, or I really like, there's a environmental theorist called Stephanie Bassa who has this idea of enclosing water. So nation states enclose things within their territory, and she says dams are just an extension of that. It's like, how do you keep, like, rivers are border flouters, right? They don't pay attention to like border controls. They'll go wherever they want. But dams is one way of territorializing water. It keeps things within our state. We can keep control on it. So what I wrote about was how there's been this slow encroachment on this region from the nations. First of all, it was the British and the Qing, and then the Chinese, the People's Republic of China and the Indian Republic kind of took over the boundaries of these two imperial predecessors and started kind of governing and ruling in those regions with more and more administration, and then more and more kind of control over flows. Yeah. And so that was like people, that was like a trade, it was animal movement even, and also water or dams. So then what I was looking at is more recently in the last, since China started doing their big build-up of dams in 2005 to 2010. And then the Indian side has kind of been trying to keep up in a way. And you've had a big proliferation of dam building on the Indians, or the India-Bhutan, I'd say, side of the border since then as well. So there's been competition between the two sides, for who can, and China's kind of winning big time. I mean, I went along, I got a chance to go along the Alansample River and see the dam projects they're doing there. And it's just, I've been privileged enough after my, after I left Australia as a teenager to go to a lot of places in the world, and I haven't seen that level of construction and transformation in one place anywhere ever in such a short period of time. It's extraordinary. And that river has been completely transformed, and that which is happening on the Indian side is not anywhere near as profound, and maybe that's a good thing. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, you did. I mean, I was just trying to absorb the tragic dimensions of that answer. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I think this is something that we've been talking about earlier as well. Himalayan studies ideally would involve, a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations between historians like yourself, linguists, anthropologists, and other disciplines that normally may not speak to one another. But you're someone who's managed to, do this quite well. Can you tell us a little bit about your collaborative journey? How do you work with people who are not historians?
Historians. Yeah, sure. I think part of that was because I did my PhD in area studies. So even though I was focused on a historical and linguistic and a literary and to some extent religious story, I was in an office with anthropologists and sociologists and all of these different people. So I was used to hearing other disciplines take on things. And in our studies, we would do the training that we had. It was like one day we're going to talk about translation. The next day we're going to talk about theory like Foucault or whatever. And then we're going to do religion. And then we're going to do geopolitics. It was very much part of the training. So it just seemed natural to me to have that perspective. But I also found that I just couldn't, you can't tell this story from one perspective. Right. So I went and tried to learn as much as I could from scientists, but I'm never going to be a scientist. I used to teach a little bit of language, mainly Tibetan, but I'm not going to be a linguist. And everybody has a different perspective on how they understand the Himalaya. And if we don't work together, it's also this idea of crisis, right? You're seeing something that is so profound and has such dimensions, so many dimensions to it. That's like all hands on deck. No time for egos, no time for disciplinary issues. Everybody has to get along and get this kind of get as much info as we can to try and figure out what's going on. So those two things combined meant that I was very open to it, I guess. And so I've worked on, I think, 3 different projects, or 3 or 4 now with 4. Because I helped on one that didn't really get funding, but we did a little bit of it on peat management. I was working with scientists on wetland peat management. And then, one on the rivers of this region with scientists, glaciologists and conservationists, anthropologists, religious studies people, and I'm also looking at sand use with political ecologists and geographers. So it feels natural and it feels good to do that. I think you would only be getting some of the story if you didn't do that. Yeah.
So that allows me to just ease into the last question, I think, and that's what are the meaningful areas where we can see traffic in ideas between Australian researchers and their counterparts, let's say in India or in Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, who do Himalayan studies?
I'd say that, well, it depends, right? Because there's different people in Australia doing it. Some people working in Australia, the Himalaya in this region is their home. And so the exchange there is very intimate and visceral and natural in a way. To my mind, I would say, given all of the world's, inequalities, colonialism, all that crap, that our role should in some way, as people who had grown up with privilege in like Western countries and so on, it should be supportive. I see it anyway, right? So we should be creating space to have within Western academia to let people from the Himalaya flourish and do all that we can to do that. I'd say that's the first thing. And try and bring the facilities that are in a place like Australia, or were until the last year or two, to put them in the service of people from the region. That's the main thing. Yeah. But there's also a thing, that idea of like, you can go back, you can take a step back and look at different pictures, like a bigger perspective on the Himalaya that isn't so grounded in one area. Maybe that can help. So support, and then bigger, like having that bigger picture things, amplifying voices, I think is also really important. I don't know, this is going to sound probably not true, and it's probably dealing with nationalist cliches, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's been my experience, I'm not sure if it's true for everyone, that maybe because Australia is very first world, but also people spend a lot of time outdoors, that of the people from different places around that go to travel in the Himalaya, I meet Australians in like, I don't know, the weirdest places, and they've been able to kind of rough it a bit. So maybe that's the specific Australian thing that could be added because the other stuff I was saying, everybody else can do as well and should do. Hey, I don't know. I'm trying to think. That's probably a dumb thing to say. I just have met people from Australia in the weirdest places. I'm like, why are you like hiking through this mountain or rafting down this river in the middle of nowhere? And it's like, so maybe that kind of Australian outdoors thing can help a bit. But it's probably not as important. The main thing is that we have to. I messed this up. I messed up my answer, but there was one other thing I was saying.
No, you haven't already. I mean, you really have. I mean, I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking that it is this Australian curiosity that can really help. Make these connections more real.
But there's also, it's not just a because that was the other thing I was thinking is, it's not just that there is kind of this kind of curiosity. I'm going to go here, and no one told me that I couldn't go places. You know what I mean? Like my partner, he's from Belfast. He was always told, don't go there, right? And I was like, I'm going snowboarding in Kashmir. No one told me not to. And he's like, are you mad? Right? So there's kind of this thing of getting into places and finding out things that maybe can help. But I'd also say that there's this other element that is particular, I'd say, between a connection between Australia and India. And that is like, I went and studied in the States. I got a chance to study science there, and I'm European as well as Australian. And when you look at India, or when people do study South Asia or East Asia, it's somewhere very kind of foreign and other. And I feel like in Australia, it's our neighbours, right? There's the climate systems are the same. It's not people don't get to 18 and they just go to Asia. It's not something that's like a completely other, right? Like the kids are learning Asian languages in school. It's much more connected. And in that way too, though, I think we have an intense responsibility because we have taken so much from Asia to give back and to listen, probably more than anywhere else on the planet.
On that wonderful note, thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you so much. It was so great.